Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait another minute or so just to allow the audience to get settled before we start the program. Thanks for your patience.
Sorry, Steve, you were muted.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started now. Thanks very much for your patience, everyone. A little bit of housekeeping to do, but before we get started on that, we're going to put a poll up on your screen. We just would like to get a little sense from you, the audience, as to your feelings on first on how the UK is doing on climate, and secondly how COP27 did on climate. So I see people are dealing with that. Thank you very much. And then on to the housekeeping. So first of all, thanks very much. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network in the UK. And you are very welcome today for our Measuring Up on Climate Reflections on COP27 webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available after the session ends. So thank you in advance for your interest in that question. Next up, we have activated the automatic captions for this webinar. You should have a button at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to turn that on if you need that function. The captions are generated automatically by Zoom, so please do forgive any typos or mistakes that are made in the text there. We are in webinar mode, and so that means that our attendees will be muted throughout the program, but we're still very, very keen to hear from you. You can comment, say hello, tell us about the weather, share your LinkedIn profile in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. But please do not ask questions in the chat unless they are rhetorical and you are directing them to your fellow attendees. If you want to direct a question to our brilliant speakers, then that needs to go into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. So please do keep that straight. If you put a question in the chat, it's very unlikely that it's going to be presented to the guests. And we as moderators are not able to move questions over and post into the Q&A box. Only attendees can do that. Another thing about the Q&A box is please keep an eye on those questions and give a thumbs up to the questions you would like us to answer. We will prioritize the questions that are getting the most votes to ensure that we're talking about the things that you're most interested in having us talk about. And then finally, of course, if you're having any technical difficulties, please do pop a message into the chat and we'll do the best we can on that. If you're using social media, please use the hashtag #measuringup in any tweets or LinkedIn posts that you're putting out in the world. That would be most appreciated. And also do please tag us and follow us if you're not already doing so on those social media accounts. And if not there already, coming soon will be some links for all of that in the chat. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, which, for the benefit of those of you that have not been to many of our webinars before, just a quick overview of the UN Global Compact and the UN Global Compact Network UK. Global Compact is the world's largest responsible business initiative, connecting companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. Our 10 universal principles are drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And they provide a rock-solid foundation upon which to base your corporate sustainability program. Easy to join, 3 commitments from your CEO to operationalize our 10 principles, to report annually on progress towards that end, and to support the wider UN development agenda, which certainly brings us together today. We've currently got 888 Global Compact participants here in the UK. If you're not one of them already, do please get in touch. Some links in the chat where you can get some more information about that. We'd love to speak with you. Okay, let's go on to our next slide, please. We have a fantastic group of speakers joining us today. And we're looking forward to a really interesting discussion. We're going to start off with my colleague, Jess Lobo, linking back to some work that we've done earlier this year on the SDGs in the UK and a report we called Measuring Up, and she's going to provide a bit of SDG UK context to the conversation to get us started. Then we're going to hear from David Schofield, Sustainability Director from Aviva. And then in no particular order, we're gonna be a little bit jumbled up and diving right into the Q&A with Michelle T. Davies, the Energy Transition and Sustainability Leader from EY, Jacob Ellis, the Lead Changemaker for Public Affairs and International Relations at the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Jacob needs very large business cards to deal with that. But also Jacob attended COP27 representing the UN Foundation, so 2 hats there. And then we'll also be joined by Anna Marie Slot, Global Sustainability and ESG Partner at Ashurst. Thanks to those of you already putting some questions into the Q&A box, most appreciated. And I see somebody has even voted for one, so let's keep that going. The poll has ended, and so I'm not sure if you can all see the results. I suppose no surprises there, but let's bear that in mind. We've got a couple of people think the UK are doing very, very well, or just very well when it comes to climate. But it looks like we have a fairly significant majority taking a more pessimistic view, and that also has translated over into COP27, although fairly large proportion of people still unsure about COP27, which I suppose explains the interest in today's webinar. Okay, let's get on with the show. I'm going to hand over now to Jess, and she's going to tell us about Measuring Up. Jess, over to you.
I can get my slides to work. There we go. So I'm going to do just a brief presentation, as Steve mentioned, on a report that we published just a couple of months ago called Measuring Up 2.0. And we worked with more than 100 different organizations and individuals, and for fantastic supporters that you can see there at the bottom of the screen, to measure how the UK is performing on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we looked at a lot of the data that is on the Office for National Statistics data platform, but also pulled in many other resources, looking at policy and what's happening over the past 4 years in particular, to understand where we are. And I just wanted to share some of our findings today. Overall, we looked at 132 of those 169 targets that sit underneath the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's because the focus of our report was very much on the domestic delivery of the goals in the UK. So we thought 132 of those targets were specifically relevant. And of those targets, we found that the UK is only making good progress on 17% of them. Majority, you can see sitting in that amber category, 64% we found had either inadequate performance or not very good policy in place to address the target. And 11% really concerning, where there's either little to no policy in place for us to address the target, and where performance is poor, or even in some cases regressing. Of course, there's that little wedge at the top there of some of the targets which we felt there wasn't enough or enough suitable data to measure that. And you'll notice what I called the report Measuring Up 2.0, and this report followed on from a first exercise that was done back in 2018. So we've got some really good comparable data, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there, overall we saw improvements in 23 targets, but regression in 18 targets. And I think the bit that's striking for me really is that bullet point at the bottom there. Of the targets in 2018, which were rated either amber or red, 65 of those have seen absolutely no change in the last 4 years, and that's particularly concerning. But of course, today we're looking specifically at climate. So I wanted to share some of those findings that we found within the climate agenda. So many of you will know that SDG 13, climate action, is probably the first place to go to look at that. And there are 3 targets within SDG 13 that we're specifically looking at. Target 13.1, which is all about strengthening resilience and adaptation. And what we found is that there is some adaptation planning across national and also local government, but it's inconsistent and piecemeal. And there are some data missing. So you can see that circle on the right-hand side, this target was one of the ones that we found in that data gap that we didn't think there was enough data for us to make a suitable red, amber, green rating. But of course, it's not just within this goal that climate action fits. So I've picked out a couple of the stats from some of the other goals that I think really demonstrate some of the interconnections between this. So goal 1, which is on no poverty, target 1.5, particularly we found in our research that there has been some significant investment in protecting households in the 20% most deprived areas of England from flooding. And that's really encouraging when we're talking about resilience and adaptation. Unfortunately, there is little evidence that there will be the same levels of investment to reduce vulnerability from heat waves, something that we've all experienced this year and we know is going to be increasing as the years go on. What we found particularly related to that goal 1 is that heat waves are currently twice as likely to impact people in deprived areas. And of course, that's got some significant knock-on effects for many of the other goals. Looking at goal 11 and particularly target 11.5 on that issue of extreme heat, it is more intense in cities than it is in surrounding rural areas. And of course, it can exacerbate air pollution and reduce many functions of key infrastructure. So a lot of concerns there, particularly relating back to that target 13.1 about some of our planning and the need for more planning in place. So target 13.2 under SDG 13 is all about integrating climate change measures into policies and planning. And there's been a lot of news about this in the recent years. What we found in our report is that government has made significant progress in increasing both the scale and the scope of its efforts to tackle climate change. But there are some really important policy and delivery gaps that persist, and that's why we rated this particular target as amber. So again, looking at some of the other goals that link into this, target 7.2, looking at energy. In the past year, so that was actually April 2021 to April 2022, renewables made up approximately 35% of our electricity supply. But there is really urgent grid infrastructure updates that are needed to be able to enable any further significant increases of that renewable energy supply. Looking at some of the transport, which is of course a huge sector in terms of our emissions, the government has pledged £2 billion for new pedestrian and cycle paths and £3 billion for integrated bus networks. But it is estimated that 700 new electrical vehicle charge points will need to be installed every day until the end of 2030 if we're going to meet that demand. So particularly some infrastructure that is needed around those 2 elements. Biodiversity and nature we know is a huge part of the climate agenda. The government has committed to increase tree planting rates to 30,000 hectares per year by March 2025. And of course, the removal of CO2 is really important. That function that's performed by mountains, moorlands and heath was estimated a few years ago to be valued at £130 million in the UK. But climate change and biodiversity are really interlinked. And what we found, particularly looking in that Goal 15 chapter, is that our response to one, and particularly our response to climate change, must not come at the cost of the other. We really need to consider the biodiversity crisis as well. And finally, on this target, a lot of what we're going to be needing to do to meet that net zero ambitions is going to be upskilling employees, making sure that we've got the skills needed. And there are some dangers that we're not there yet. We particularly need education. We also need to be considering those wider themes around the just transition, which are not yet coming through in the UK. And so the last target, 13.3, relates to that point that I just made, which is all about education needed to be able to take climate action. And this relates, of course, to Goal 4 on quality education. As yet, climate change, biodiversity and sustainability are not part of the core curriculum, nor are they part of framework for teacher training, integral to school inspections or central to exams specifications, all of which is needed to ensure that this is a key part of our education. And linking to Goal 12 there, although that many still lack the information and awareness, the good news is that we are starting to see climate change and sustainability issues increasingly covered by sections of the mainstream print and broadcast media. So that is looking a little bit more on the positive side. I think the key message that we found in the report is that we are leaving people and places behind in the UK, and we're failing to recognise some of the interconnections between the goals. So we mentioned transport a couple of slides ago. What we found is that more than 51% of public transport users in rural areas do not have access to their nearest hospital within an hour. And of course, that is relating to a number of different goals within this agenda. And of course, similar with looking at how we fit our homes and make sure that they are fit around energy efficiency, being able to help us reduce carbon emissions, but also meeting our health, meeting some of those equalities goals as well. The good news is that there has been a real marked shift in engagement across the business sectors, particularly in the last few years. And in the report, there are nearly 50 inspirational case studies demonstrating really what we can achieve when we turn our minds to this agenda. And of course, the link there for the report is at the bottom slide. So my final slide, really what I'd like to encourage everybody to do, that was just a very, very small taster of all of the different findings that are found in the report. So please go and download it for yourself, share the findings and help us amplify some of those recommendations that we've made. And finally, my last call to action is to take inspiration from some of those case studies. I'm going to leave that there and hand over to David, who's going to tell us a little bit how this compares to the rest of the G7 countries that they've been doing in their Climate Ready Index. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Jess, and congratulations to you and the UNGC team for an excellent report. Very, very useful. So I'm going to talk to you about the Aviva Climate Ready Index. And if we come to the next slide, what is that all about? Well, it's a report we put out in the run-up to COP, and we will put out every year in the run-up to COP, and it ranks the G7 plus island on their climate readiness. And as Jess has outlined, of course, climate readiness exists beyond just mitigation. It's not just about the race to zero, it's about the race to resilience, and those people factors, that combination of people and planet is what climate readiness focuses on. What we're trying to do with this is not give like a definitive diagnosis of the climate readiness of these countries, but we pull in a range of authoritative external data sources, and then we've also run some data ourselves with people like YouGov and Ipsos, etc., to look at climate readiness really broadly, whether that's about, if we come to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit more about what's in the model. Focus on emissions and mitigation, really important. But of course, environment and adaptation, i.e. biodiversity, for example, a huge part of climate readiness. Then economy and business, particularly, I think, important for this audience. So how are we seeing investment flows flow into this? So of course, Aviva is from financial services. So we have a keen interest in how we can structure and incentivize the financial system so that capital flows to deliver the transition that we all need. So we're looking at those economic measures, but also things like innovation. So we know that if we're going to hit where we need to hit by 2050, if not sooner, so Aviva, we have a 2040 net zero target. That's going to take some technological innovation. So it also looks at innovation. And finally, climate readiness, of course, has to look at societies and communities. SMEs have to be part of the way we think about businesses, individual households and individual consumers, although they may feel powerless in the overall scheme of things. Actually harnessing and releasing the potential of consumer-driven change has to be part of the way that we look at this. And of course, the impact on the most vulnerable. So the Climate Ready Index does track contributions towards that big 100 billion target globally through overseas development budgets, but also impacts on the lower socioeconomic groups who often have the lowest climate resilience in our communities. So let's have a look at how we did in the UK. Our ambition is to support the UK to be the most climate ready large economy, but we are not there yet. And I think it's true to say no one's doing great. So the score is out of 100, top scorers are in the 60s. The UK comes in third behind Germany and France. And you can see US and Canada are there at the bottom of the scale. Why is that? So if we come over to the next slide, let's give a couple of examples of what's going on there. It's interesting to note that it is a real mixed bag, and our point actually to spin that positively is that actually with collaboration there are strengths that exist across this group of countries, and of course, you know, globally. We do cite who's best in class in each of these, and some of that is not global north countries, but there are lessons to be learnt right across the globe. The UK, in terms of its scoring in third, is a real mixed bag. So the UK does score well on emissions and mitigation, and it's heartening to see maybe a little bit more leaning into that in the current format of our ever-changing government. But we need to see those plans followed through into action. And Jess has described some of the ways that needs to come through. Where does the UK score lower? So echoing some of the things Jess was talking about, so biodiversity, where we're fifth, and you look at the WWF Living Planet report recently, we have very significant degradation of biodiversity in this country. Interestingly, that seems to be a mass consumer concern as well. We're also lagging behind a little bit on, whilst we have good capability in terms of adaptation and resilience within our plans, we're not necessarily seeing granular plans in place at a national and regional level with the kind of tracking and monitoring that happens in Germany and France of those. And I think business has a huge role to play in supporting, generating and helping deliver those national and regional climate resilience and adaptation plans. Lots of cities are looking at this issue and wrestling with this issue. And we're very often significant players in the lives of those cities. And then the really interesting bit that I wanted to finish on, really, which is a challenge for all of us on the call, and probably if we're on this call, we have a role to play in reaching out to others, which is very much the mission of the UNGC, is the UK actually has the second lowest of this group ranking in terms of business readiness. And when we survey businesses, we actually have the biggest gap between concern, and this is particularly looking at SMEs, but concern around climate and actual action on climate. So climate transition plans, net zero plans, but also climate resilience and adaptation plans. So plans for how to deal with these impacts on supply chain, how to engage with consumers around these issues, how to take business opportunities that are present in the transition that we need to make. So the UK really has work to do, and I think we all have a role to lead and support that transition. What we've seen in the data is where you've got high levels of support and high levels of concern, you get action. at the UK, we both need to dial up the understanding of the issue, the concern and the pressure on business to act, but particularly dial up at a government level and at a peer level, and those organisations supporting businesses in the UK, trade associations, sector-based approaches, to actually provide practical, pragmatic support for businesses to in many cases start and certainly accelerate their transition to be climate ready. If you want more interest, if you're interested, you want more detail, if you just search Aviva Climate Ready Index, you'll find the full report with lots more detail at a country level. We'd love to talk to you more about it and to collaborate with you on actually turning some of the insights into action and innovation. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, David. That's really interesting stuff. Quite enlightening, I think, for us, that I suppose we're in a bit of a bubble because we're typically working with companies that are already quite committed and engaged with this agenda, and do forget the vast majority out there that are not. David, could I just draw your attention to a question that's gone into the Q&A box from Karen that I think is begging out for a written answer, if you don't mind, just to give a little bit more detail on some of the technicalities of your study, which I certainly look forward to reading. So both from Jess and David, we've had, I suppose, a reinforcement that the general consensus from our poll is based probably to a large extent on reality. So that's not great news, but good to see that we're at least have our eyes open to this, and that understanding is there. Could I invite everybody now, all of the speakers, to turn their cameras on? Jacob, Michelle, Anna Marie, and let's get going. Now, as I understand it, Anna Marie and Jacob, you were actually in Sharm el-Sheikh, but Michelle, since we were at the Eden Project at the same time, I suspect that you were not there. But you know, my experience from COP26 last year was that it can be quite difficult when you're in the fray to actually get much of an opinion. I came away, probably lasting impression for me from COP26 was the vegan haggis that they were serving up in the canteen, and the challenges around food. And I understand that was something that happened again in a big way in Egypt. How about we start with just a quick round of, let's put our cards on the table. What were your expectations? Were they met? Maybe, I know this is getting longer and longer as I keep adding. Maybe one thing that you were really happy about and one thing you're really disappointed about. I'm just thinking in the order on my screen. So why don't we start with Jacob and then Michelle and then Anna Marie, if that works for you guys.
Thank you, Steve. Borodan, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thanks for those quick presentations, but very, very insightful. Yeah, that haggis and then selling of fish and chips at Glasgow next to that model of a fish being swallowed. The plastic stuff was just ironic in Glasgow. But look, Sharm el-Sheikh was set up as this African COP, wasn't it, and the implementation COP, and the backdrop. And it's important to recognise the backdrop this time round, more so, I think, than previous COPs, of the global context of those political divides, the relationships between countries, fragmented, the China, Taiwan, USA stuff, the Ukraine, Russia backdrop, and of course the global food and energy crisis at around this year's COP, that meant that this was going to be a difficult one. I think the priority around spend, this expectation around loss and damage, and I think G20 summit happening at the same time also had its significance as well. A new prime minister for us attending. Was he coming? Was he not coming? That taking up some of the headlines beforehand, and the new president of Brazil attending. So I think that all these different changes at this time was quite significant. You're asking for one bad thing and one good thing. I won't mention the food, the toilets, the logistics, the fact that I think that having it in Egypt in itself was controversial. I think as well, we've got this thing happening at the moment of big events being hosted by countries that shouldn't be hosting, in my opinion, some of these global events, or not being held to account on their current records on things. Political point aside for now. But I think that I was energized by the number of young people at this COP. The first time to have a COP youth envoy with a formal role there. The first time to have a children and youth pavilion in the Blue Zone, really anchoring and bringing young people together. And we saw an increase, as I understand, in the number of youth negotiators. Back in COP25, only a quarter of negotiators were under 35, and we've been seeing those numbers increase. And I think having young people take a lead or be part of those conversations is enlightening. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about the commitments later on, but just as a general observation, that was a good thing. But I do sense, however, that we're just not doing good enough, and that really came across it at COP. Yes, we can celebrate loss and damage. Yes, it's a significant historic moment. It's important that emphasis is put on loss and damage. But when we were asking in Glasgow for those new commitment plans to be produced by this COP, and only 24 of 190 countries or so had done so. And whilst we can take great enthusiasm from Australia and European Union resubmitting their plans, only 24. I don't think we're taking it as seriously as we should. And if we're going on the current targets of those plans, we're actually going to be increasing our emissions by 10%, and we should be seeing them decrease by 40% by 2030. So I just don't think, but I recognize the political context, that the hard nature of this negotiation summit. But I do have a disheartened feeling that yes, we can celebrate loss and damage, but I don't think we did enough at Sharm el-Sheikh. And actually, as a final point, Steve, that even on the second day, somebody had said, I'm looking forward to COP28. Now, if I hear somebody say that they're looking forward to a COP, we're failing. We shouldn't be having this idea that, oh, great, we'll come back in COP28, oh, I'm back in COP29. The idea is to eradicate COPs, not look forward to them in the long term.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also, lots of, actually, I'm hearing more doom expressed about COP28 in advance, rather than optimism for it. So, Michelle, what were your takes?
So even though I wasn't there, Steve, my colleagues were there in force, and I think that the growing number of corporates and real economy corporates and financial institutions who were in attendance has to be seen as a positive thing, because it means that they recognise that this is an agenda that they need to be understanding and participating in. I think one of the key themes that came away for the EY team was, whilst real economy corporates and financial institutions understand the need to be part of the agenda, still a significant proportion are really struggling to understand exactly what it is that they need to do. So there is regulation that is hitting them at various junctures, in particular if they are a financial institution or a listed entity or a large entity with requirements to achieve sustainability or decarbonisation positions. But what they're really struggling with is, how do they transition, how do they achieve sustainability in a way that is truly valuable? And that has to include being financially valuable as well for the organisation, because it has key stakeholders to which it is responsible. It has people like Aviva and others who it needs to deliver value for. So I think that in summary, and I appreciate, in order for COP to be successful, it needs government action, business action, individual action. But if I just focus on the business piece, a positive is that companies that weren't at the previous COP were at this COP. They realize they have to be understanding this. The biggest challenge they have is, how do we make this work? How do we approach this within our organization? But super importantly, how do we do so in a way that creates value and isn't seen as a tick the box exercise and something that is solely about eradicating risk? How do we make this about enabling the transition to make us more valuable for all of our key stakeholders, not just the financial ones, but also employees and the stakeholders who are within the communities within which they operate? And that is the bit that I think is creating the biggest challenge for those companies. And that's what we saw really coming out of COP this year.
Thanks, Michelle. Anna-Marie.
Sure, thanks. Look, I won't talk about the food. The food in Glasgow and the food, and it's not a high point of any COP. I think my experience down in Sharm, one of the things that I agree with Jacob in some ways, it was good to have it in Africa. I think the Egyptians definitely saw themselves as the gateway to Africa, and to have that role. And I think you didn't see as much in Glasgow of those different countries. Obviously, it was just coming out of COVID. There was problems with logistics of getting people there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that was a very good thing to have it there and to bring it front of mind for people in that area. This is something that's coming. This is something we have to talk about. That to me is the real benefit of a COP, is that every year there is that super high level, everybody's covering it in the news, everybody's talking about it, and that cascades through the conversations. I think that having the companies there and having lots of different companies there from lots of different industries was also a very good thing. I think in Glasgow, they took the position that various companies shouldn't be there. But really, my position is always that we don't have some special box or room in the world that you could put all the people you don't like. There's not an island that doesn't connect with the rest of the atmosphere. And so you actually, the point is we have to transition everything and everyone. And to do that, you need to be talking to everyone and about everything. I think one of the things maybe that I was slightly disappointed by, and there was obviously right before COP, it was kind of unclear who was even going. There was in the end a good turnout in terms of people there. I think one thing that was slightly disappointing is that there were lots of instances of people talking to themselves. So COP is this. If you haven't been there, it's like this gigantic collective of it's like a trade fair with a whole bunch of trade negotiations going on at the same time. So you can walk into a room and listen to people who, well, do we want an and in this sentence or do we need an or in this sentence, right? They're really, really dull conversations that mean a lot later. But they're not fascinating for anyone, including the people who are actually doing the negotiation. And then there are lots and lots of presentations. So in the Blue Zone, everybody had a pavilion. The UK had a pavilion. We Mean Business had a pavilion. The ICC had a pavilion. Singapore had a pavilion. Egypt had a pavilion. Everybody had a pavilion. To Jacob's point, youth had a pavilion. And so each of those pavilions are running their own thing. So it's a little bit of FOMO going on, right? Like, there's sort of 10 panels you could be listening to at the same time, and you have to try to figure out where to go to them. And so I think one thing that loses, while that creates an enormous amount of content and interesting things, and most people were now putting those up afterwards so that you can follow on that. But there is so much going on that at some point people kind of tend towards where they were already going. And one of the things that we really need, and that everybody talks about, is that we need a collaborative solution, and we need everybody in the room talking to each other. And I think that's the thing that kind of at that scale is quite hard to do, you know, when you have 30,000 people roaming around, plus all of the people who are in the pavilions. So I guess that would be kind of my impressions from COP. But and then the logistics were quite complicated in COP because you couldn't sort of walk between things very easily. You know, there were lots of side events that were going on, which were quite interesting. And that's where, you know, to Michelle's point, business was coming in on a lot of those side events, doing really, really interesting things, but not, you know, that took you completely out of the zone, and it took you another half a day to kind of come back from that. And so that wasn't terribly efficient. Whereas in Glasgow, a lot of those things were walking distance from each other.
And even then, I just about wore out a pair of shoes there, because the scale is so huge, isn't it? That even having things side by side, the distances are massive. I want to circle back to it's not the top question, but it's popular, and I think it links into some of the things you were just talking about, Anne-Marie, about who comes and who doesn't come. And one of the most controversial aspects of the COP was the very significant presence of the fossil fuel industry there. Big numbers of lobbyists, you know, stories of deals being cut in the margins. And what do we think about that? So this, Richard has posted this question into the Q&A box. So is that perhaps, would you, so maybe, yeah, starting with Anne-Marie, would you make an exception and put some constraints on a specific sector, or do we put like a cap on, or you know, some way of managing that?
Well, it's a great question, but the implementation of any kind of restriction would be really difficult to do in real life, right? You could say that you weren't there to lobby and then show up and lobby. No one's gonna. It's too big a platform for people to be monitoring. And I thought, anyway, I think it's odd, and it would be a bad idea to monitor what people are saying inside. But you know, I hope and I think that the people, whether or not you're influenced by a lobbyist depends on what you already know, what information you have, and how willing you are to be critical of what someone's saying to you, right? And I think you're not going to be able to bar people from going as lobbyists. I think where we need to get to is the realization that there's no time here for having a negotiation. The IPCC report is very, very clear there, you know, about what's happening and what has to happen by 2030. And it's about educating the businesses who are paying for the lobbyists and the various countries who are paying for the lobbyists to say, look, actually, you're costing yourself more, because the longer you put off making this transition, the more expensive and more disruptive it will be. And that, I don't know that you're shooting yourself in the foot kind of conversation is quite happening right now. It's interesting, and people are starting to do that. There's certainly a huge focus on identifying lobbying that's paid for by companies, right? And so, and I think shedding the light on lobby amounts that are being paid by companies is probably more useful than trying to control who shows up at COP. I don't know if Jacob and Michelle have different. If anybody has a solution, let me know.
I think it's possibly more valuable also to talk about who, if they're there, who isn't there. So there was, looking around COP, there were certain demographics, in my opinion, that were missing. So the indigenous communities struggle to come to COP generally, wherever they are in the world. And I think there was a lack of presence and visibility this year, more so I think than in COP26 this time round. Indeed, I've never seen really high numbers of disabled people or older people young people differently this time in COP27, but this year in COP, it was more apparent to me that of who wasn't there rather than who were there. Just in terms of the lobbyists, just to help give us figures here, the number of delegates with links to fossil fuels this year jumped 25%. So just to give an idea of numbers, that's 636 compared to 503 at COP26. Now versus 45,000 or so, or 40,000 delegates at COP. The numbers, okay, are increasing, but they don't make up the majority by far of the numbers present. I do think personally that there are value in having all quarters, all sectors represented and attending COP. What we have to avoid is the greenwashing that comes with those lobbyists being present. But I think that the number of people who are there for the not the right reasons, because I believe that anybody comes to COP actually with some intention of trying to do good. And I think there is still value, therefore, of talking about everybody attending COP. Can I just briefly comment, Steve, on the response that I got that said that Egypt shouldn't have hosted? I think, that it is really important that we're transparent about where countries or which countries host different things. And I think that comes down to timing, the support, the transparency, the resources available. So I think that UNFCCC have to set out questions and set out more clearly why certain countries are hosting and what can it do to best support those countries when they do host. And I think that we shouldn't shy away from challenging hosts on their records and their transparency around certain targets and certain actions. And I certainly wasn't suggesting that countries in Africa or countries in the global south in particular shouldn't be hosting in COP. So I think that we've got lots to take away from the positives of Egypt, but let's not shy away from calling them out, as we will for other events and other hosts around the world for their records against various targets as well. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jacob. Michelle, quick view on attendees.
Fossil fuel. Yeah, I mean, look, the fossil fuel industry, number one, it has to transition. Number two, at the moment, there is a need for what they're selling. We need to buy what they're selling as part of that transition. Linked into a question that's come up around the skills gap, it's going to be incredibly important that all of those people employed in the fossil fuel sector are reskilled into energy transition sectors. And therefore, if we stop giving the fossil fuel industry a voice and an ability to participate, we put a whole host of different things at risk. So my view is they need to be there. However, the basis on which they are there, and this is my view, it's not EY's view, needs to be clear. They should only be there if they can clearly show that they have an intent backed up by a plan to transition within a time frame that is acceptable. If they have no intent and no plan, and all they are there for is to lobby for unnecessary time or greater participation in the energy mix than is needed, then I think that creates a serious concern. So this, and I have to stress, this is my view. Yes, they should be there because they need to transition and we need what they're selling at the moment. But they should be there with preconditions, and those preconditions should be around the viability and transparency of their transition plans. And I'm really hoping that something like TPT gets adopted more widely around the world, because I think that TPT has the ability to actually be more transformative and more impactful than regulation like TCFD, for reasons I can explain if that's of interest. But that would be my
Michelle,
view.
let's start just for the uninitiated. What's TPT?
Oh, it's the Transition Plan Task Force, which is hopefully coming into effect at some point earlier in the year in the UK. It's going to apply predominantly to listed companies to start off with and financial institutions, and it's going to require them by the end of next year to publish their transition plans and report on them publicly. And the fact that these transition plans are now going to be in the public domain, and the progress against those plans is going to be in the public domain, has the potential to significantly impact the way that stakeholders engage with those organisations that have to generate them and report on them.
No, great, thank you. Yeah, I think that absolutely has the potential to be a real game changer, and let's hope. And I think a really credible suggestion to link that into attendance, as someone who's been on the difficult end of trying to get passes to the blue zone. It does seem, I mean, the bureaucracy is extraordinary. And if you want to attend COP28 as a non-party, you know, the window is already closed to apply. You had to apply last August. So now the next COP you could even think about going to, unless you have friends that are already down as observers, would be COP29. So there already are some great controls in place, but of course it is very opaque, isn't it? And the parties to the convention, I think, have very few restrictions on who they might invite along, and that may be a backdoor. Okay, I don't want to spend the whole session, and we're running out of time so fast. Really quick one, and maybe we can all just give a thumbs up and agree with Edward. He's got the most votes there, and we're obviously strong advocates for the SDGs. And Edward is just asking, do we agree that the SDGs are most important plans for the planet still? And we sort of touched on that need for a more holistic approach. Edward, of course, or Jacob, sorry, this is probably close to your heart with the Future Generations Act. Are the SDGs still relevant in the climate conversation?
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, they have to be. You know, I think that we have to remember why we have them and how they came about in the first place, and what is tying together every country in the world. And the SDGs are those links. Now we can all, you know, when we look at the SDG summit that the UN will host this year, we'll have to reflect on the progress to date and what is necessary, what is needed as we move to within this final decade here. And I'm sure that we can say that some of those SDGs were in a worse place than when we started with them. And I'm sure there are SDGs that are missing now in a different context. But I think that, you know, just briefly on the Welsh example, so we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the only country in the world to have legislated to put the SDGs into law. And we have created our own set of national well-being goals that translate back to the SDGs. This importance of looking at those SDGs holistically, finding those connections, making them clear that we're not targeting SDGs in silos, and remembering that SDG 17 around partnerships, around the goals. I do think that we are, as we enter into this multi-crisis period, or continue to be in a multi-crisis period, that we're picking off our approaches in terms of solutions versus on specific goals, and not seeing the connected nature between the cost of living crisis and the climate change, between racial injustice and climate change, and so on, as we're all familiar with on this screen. So I do think there is an importance of looking more holistically at solutions through the lens of the SDGs, rather than trying to isolate them out in particular.
I would just jump in quick there. I would echo that. I think the SDGs, number one, they were actually collectively created, right? And so when people argue about who's in the room having the conversations, I think the SDG is probably still one of the best examples of all of the countries together talking about it, not just the global north, the global south, whichever subgroup you want to talk to. The other thing that I think the SDGs does, which gets lost, and if you're reading the press, there's this huge focus at the moment to should we separate the E, the S, and the G, because they're all so difficult and it's all so hard, and frankly, I can't fit it into my spreadsheet because I don't have a number for it. Is really what that conversation comes down to, in my opinion. I see Michelle laughing. But the SDGs go, that's nice that you can't delineate it down into a single answer. It's not a single answer, right? There is, climate is a social question. Immigration is intrinsically related to drought, right? These things are not, it's not a single little thing, and it's too, I know it's difficult, and businesses find it exceedingly difficult, right? Because they're designed around single metrics. And that, frankly, in my opinion, again, my opinion only, that's what got us here. It is that single metric approach, which we can't replicate. We don't have time to replicate it. We don't have time to come up with a single emissions metric that governs the world and then move to a single social and then move to a single governance. This all has to be happening together and not in a linear fashion, given the time scale that we're on.
Michelle, you get the final word as we were running out of time.
Oh, I would just echo what Anna. I can't top what Anna Marie just said. I completely agree. Just an observation, really, though. I think that they are critically important. However, I do think we are at a juncture now where, and as I said before, corporations are still very much focused on the risk of climate change rather than seeing the value, and that is something that I would like to see change. But we are starting to really see the financial institutions make investment decisions around and insurance decisions, financial decisions, whether to lend money, whether to invest, whether to insure, around whether this organization, this corporate, is actually a viable bet for the future. And climate and how it is adapting to climate and how it is looking at changing its business so that its business is appropriate for the transitioning world is now becoming a reality. And it's only when these things become a reality that CEOs start to change the way that they behave. So the CGG is crucially important, but I do think we are at a juncture where at least risk in business and finance is becoming, or climate risk is becoming better understood and is starting to really influence decision making.
Thank you all. I agree with all of these points. Delighted to see all the love of the SDGs, and that's certainly important to us. It's been clearly transformative, the awakening, I suppose, of the sleeping giant of the investment community to become one of the most powerful drivers of change. That we waited so long for that recognition that sustainable companies were more valuable, and now that's really becoming so important in helping us to drive change. So and that was another key outcome from the COP, I think, in terms of developing that further. So thank you, Jacob, Michelle, and Anna Marie, and David and Jess for all of your contributions. Thanks very much to our audience for so many great questions, and apologies that we couldn't get through more of them. But there are going to be some more opportunities coming up to engage around COP27, led by less by us at the UK network and a bit more by our colleagues out of UN Global Compact headquarters. And so apologies to my team if I've gotten things a little bit out of order, but there will be links coming in the chat really soon. Now, we've got a couple of slides just to take us out the door, and just to share with you some of our upcoming activities. So here it comes. So firstly, have a look in the chat box. There's a link there to a webinar coming up next week that's been organized by our colleagues at Global Compact headquarters, looking at some of the key outcomes. Global Compact released a whole bunch of new reports during the COP. Mostly will be business oriented, and we certainly encourage you to have a look at those. Coming up closer to home, though, here in the UK network. Now, a caution that both of these things are for Global Compact Network members only. But if you're really interested, there's time to join. Our SDG Innovation Accelerator for Young Professionals is a fantastic program. We've run it. This will be our third year of running it. Tremendously successful for young professionals under 35, coming together to develop a breakthrough innovation mindset to help make your company move along faster. Information on that coming to the chat. Also, we're launching a brand new accelerator program on business and human rights, working with Shift, a really highly regarded organization in the business and human rights space. This will help companies to develop policies and practices relating to human rights due diligence, to make sure you're at an appropriate standard there. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, that's the last slide. Okay. I think we've got all our links done. I'm just, scanning. We have a newsletter for network members, and we have a newsletter for non-members. I think we're going to have a link going into the chat again for that in a moment. And we've got another survey coming your way, just to get a little bit of feedback on how we did today, and to have your inputs so that we can improve our programming going forward. Thanks all very much for joining us today. I think it's still maybe a day away from wishing happy holidays, although I suppose I just did. We're going to be going a little bit more quiet now for the next few weeks, but we have some fantastic programming teed up for 2023. If you're not already following us on social media, that's a great way to keep in touch with our programming, and be able to join us again. Thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.